Hi there, my name is Kala, and most of all in my life, I love milk. But it turned out that this is actually a real hell for me. Of course, only for my body. And to be honest, I still haven't managed to get used to such a condition. In my opinion, even before my birth, every day in our family started and ended with a glass of fresh milk brought by the farmer directly from the cow. My parents always said that it's very useful for a growing child's body and it's a source of calcium and protein. And since habits that were started with us from a very early age are most often ingrained in our lives, by our teens, I couldn't imagine my life without milk. Moreover, my parents and older sister also drank it every day, hand in plenty. But unlike the rest of the family, I never had health and strength because I was always suffering from a cough, runny nose, and diathesis. As long as I can remember, I was always dealing with this and it never passed even for a little while. My parents were sure that this was just what I had to deal with and there was nothing to be done. In general, I seemed to be quite healthy. That was so up to a point. But when I turned 14 years old, right on my birthday, I went into the intensive care unit because my cough was so painful that I began to choke on my own phlegm. They hooked me up to a long ventilator and tried to find the cause of the suffering, but it was all in vain. Yes, some blood was taken, but the test never showed anything, so there was no diagnosis, and all looked very strange. After 4 days, I was transferred to an ordinary ward because I felt a little bit better, and my parents immediately arrived there with bottles of milk and a homemade cottage cheese. It was necessary to restore the strength of this exhausted girl. That same evening, I was again transferred to that intensive care unit with the same symptoms. All sorts of different specialists came to see me. They carried out a bunch of tests, but they found absolutely nothing wrong. This time, I stayed in the intensive care unit for a week, and my harassed parents were waiting for me in the ward again. My mother is wailing, wondering who I'd take after to be so weak and what she should do with me, and my father alone silently looking at me. They gave me some milk again and told me to drink it instead of water and left. That night, I felt so bad that I couldn't even take half a breath. The choking began, and in a panic, I only managed to press the medical alert button to call the nurse. After that, I lost consciousness and came to my senses in the intensive care unit. The period of my stay there increased again, this time up to 10 days. The doctors were shocked and whispered to each other about something, but I understood that if it continues at this pace, in a couple of weeks, I would just stay in the intensive care unit for a whole month. And there was a chance that even the doctors wouldn't be able to help me. It was necessary to look for the cause of my lung problems and understand where this mucus in my body was coming from, but even the doctors were confused. When I returned to the intensive care unit, I decided to provide myself a complete detox program and asked my parents not to come see me for a while. I wanted to stay alone with myself, read books, and figuring out what was causing my vulnerability. My mom was very upset by such a statement, but she said that it was my right, and in that case, she would send me a bottle of milk through the nurses and reminded me that I should drink it as often as possible. The first couple of days, I drank only water because I felt that my body needed to be cleansed. Then I started looking through our family photos, reading messages from my parents, and I was deeply touched. They loved me so much and were very worried about me. My mom asked me to drink the milk that she had sent specifically for me. Oh, Mom, how much I love her. I took the coveted bottle from the refrigerator and took only a couple sips, relishing such a familiar taste and remembering my parents. I guess I have to call them and thank them for the milk, I thought, and I went to the phone. I didn't start calling right away because I saw a notification on my phone about a new video coming out on my favorite channel. The video lasted for 10 minutes, and when it ended, I realized that my lungs were filled with mucus again. I started to panic. I pressed the medical alert button and drank almost a whole bottle of water at once to come to my senses. They wanted to send me back to the intensive care unit, but then they saw that my condition wasn't critical and left me in the regular ward, saying that I would have to wait for some famous professor. He was called to our clinic especially for me. This was good news. I could only hope that I wouldn't get worse. Otherwise, I would have to postpone the meeting with the professor. I took a couple of sips again and then got stuck on YouTube. Soon, my breathing worsened again. I tried to stay calm and distracted myself as best I could. In a few minutes, the itching started all over my body. I looked at my hands and they were covered with red spots. It seemed that because of my nerves and exasperation of the diathesis again, only the spots weren't the same as before, and my body had never been so itchy. I thought I somehow infected myself in the hospital, so I called the nurse. She brought me some kind of cream and smeared it all over me. Only it made me feel even worse. The intense itching simply became unbearable and the spots began to turn into blisters. I called my mother and said that I was very scared, and I asked her to come because I was afraid that I would go into the intensive care unit again. Mom said that she would come in 30 minutes and advised me to drink milk. I wanted to scream at her, "Mom, what milk? Are you really worried about now?" But then I pulled myself together and promised her I would take a few more sips. Well, it's not difficult for me. After my conversation with my mom, the famous professor entered the ward. At that moment, I was just drinking the milk. He began to ask me some questions and asked me to tell as much about myself as possible. 10 minutes after starting our conversation, I began to cough and choke, and the blisters were covering my whole body, which hurt like hell. I was immediately transferred to the intensive care unit. This time, I was put into an induced coma, and I woke up after 3 days in the ordinary ward. There was a professor with some papers in his hands. He asked me how I felt, and at that same moment, my parents came into the ward. My mother had a bottle of milk in her hands. She immediately began to open it, holding my cup in her other hand. The professor told my mother that she would have to forget about the milk forever, or at least make sure that it wouldn't ever enter my body in any way again, because it acts like a poison for me. My mom thought the professor was mistaken and told him, "Oh, come on, doctor. This is just milk. We buy it from the farmer. It's the healthiest drink for children." And then she gave me a glass. Then the professor said that if I drank what she gave me, in 10 minutes I would start choking again. My body would be covered with blisters even more, and this time it's possible that they couldn't save me because I'm allergic to cow's milk protein and lactose. And then he handed my mom a stack of papers that he had had in his hand the whole time. Mom still couldn't believe it, and the professor continued to shock her. He said that the cause of my suffering was in milk right from my birth. When I began to suffer from diathesis and incomprehensible mucus, all this time my parents were poisoning me with milk, pouring the strongest allergen into me, which accumulated in my body for years and almost killed me. All these words were confirmed by the test results. Everyone was shocked. For 14 years, I suffered and thought that I was somehow inferior and sick, but it turned out that I just needed to exclude gluten and milk from my diet, and I was given way too much milk to drink almost from birth, you know? Then I realized that, in fact, milk is not the drink in which I couldn't live without. It's just a tradition that was forced on me from my family. However, breaking off this habit was not so simple. I drank milk for 14 years, and it was not easy to just stop doing it right away. Nevertheless, I found a way out and simply replace cow's milk with goat's milk. That's all. No more allergies, no more mucus, no cough, no blisters. I began to feel much better. I seemed to be filled with life and energy, and I even began to move around easier. You know, sometimes I think about what would have happened if not for the professor. Most likely I would simply die after another cup of milk from choking, or septic fever because of popping blisters would lead to this sooner or later. Now I am incredibly happy that I managed to escape death and even got rid of this chronic disease. Now I have a completely different quality of life. I have an individual menu in my family. This doesn't trouble anyone because I can cook for myself.